The war in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas has now roared past 6-month mark and is heading into the second half year of operations. It shows no sign of abating anytime soon. In fact, there is the Israeli side appears to be set up for a major operation into the southern part of the strip, into the Rafah area, which has all kinds of potentials to go sideways and spike in casualties. It's causing a lot of friction between the United States and Israel itself. There's also looming a potential Iranian response to their embassy being destroyed. And what may happen after that is anybody's guess, but it's probably not good. We'll actually be talking in more detail of that toward the end of this segment. But first of all, I want to take a step back and really for all of our viewers to really put all of this in context to understand how we got to this point. If we're ever going to be able to get out of here, it's crucial to understand all the dynamics and the influences and the power and the human dynamics that went into creating this situation so that you can understand what may be a path out. And we have a guy who literally wrote the book on this, one of our new favorites, Colonel Jacques Baud. We've seen it before. It's right there over your shoulder. You've recently published a book just a month or so ago, I guess, right?
Yes,
the
that's
Al
correct.
Aqsa storm, Al Aqsa flood. Sorry, the Al Aqsa flood. And you talk about in there a lot about what happened on October 7th, but you also talk about some of the things leading up to that point, which were instrumental in that, both on the Israeli and Hamas side. And so we're really eager to just jump into that. So let's just get right into it. So first of all, tell us a little bit about what prompted you to write the book and what things you discovered in the process of doing it that it led to it in the first place.
Well, in fact, when this issue erupted on the 7th of October, first of all, I started the book before that. In fact, I started the book a few weeks before the 7th of October because I felt that something was boiling there and that we had to expect a problem. And I started just a few weeks before the 7th of October. But the interesting thing is that by writing a book, you have to dig into things, and I went through history, and definitely what I discovered was even beyond what I expected. In fact, because it showed that we have a very poor understanding of the whole conflict. To be honest, I was during my work in intelligence, I've been in touch, and I have several friends, Israeli friends working in Israeli intelligence. I had quite extensive contact with them and always good contact with them. And I never realized that, in fact, the situation of Israel is very different from the one we tend to understand in the West. And that's this book allowed me to go deeper into history, and I really advise people, not just because I'm the author, but because it explains a lot of things that we have no idea. And that's a reason probably I would like to go through a little bit of history today to understand how the reality in this conflict is misrepresented in our media.
Terrific.
And if you allow me, I would start at the very beginning of the history, in fact, which is in fact Resolution 181, which was adopted on the 29th of November 1947. And this is the UN resolution that allows to partition the existing state of Palestine into two different states, because that's something we always tend to forget. And before writing this book, I always forgot that in fact you had a state of Palestine between 1921 and 1948, in fact. And Ben
So
Gurion.
actually on that point, because that's a point of potential misinformation, I guess, because I have heard many commentators in Western media say that actually there was no Palestinian state. It was just people living out in this area, which
No.
may not matter that much. But you're saying there actually was a Palestinian state of some degree?
It was. You can even find videos on the YouTube where Golda Meir, one of the first leaders of the Israeli state, she said, "I had a Palestinian passport. I was Palestinian." So during these 27 years, which were under the mandate of the British. The British had received from the League of Nations a mandate to manage this territory, the administration, in fact, of this territory after the fall of the Ottoman Empire.
Mm.
But the territory was a political entity, and you had people had a Palestinian passport, so the state of Palestine did exist. You even had a Palestinian Olympic Committee, in
Oh,
fact.
wow.
So yeah, it was a full a state. It had some institutions that were managed by the British, but it was a state. And the UN resolution 181 had in mind to offer the opportunity to have a Jewish state as well within this territory. And it's important also because media tend to say that the Israel was created by the United Nations. That's wrong. The United Nations offered the opportunity to partition Palestine into two countries. And that's this map that we know, which is widely presented, that you have this state of Palestine here. This is the whole surface here, and on that you have a proposed Israeli territory here and a proposed Palestinian territory here in green. Opla, sorry. And the interesting thing is that in this resolution, it was said because the United Nations don't have the power to give territory. They don't have the power to take territory from someone and to give it to someone else. Therefore, the resolution provided for having referendum to make the population decide by itself whether or not it wanted to partition the country. And in fact, you had two visions at this point in Palestine. You had the Arab population; they wanted to keep the existing state of Palestine, and you had the Jews who wanted to have their own territory
So
because
now
that's
let me
what
ask
they.
you, do you know that when this 181 was devised, the map you're showing right there, what
Yeah.
it obviously wasn't going to be ethnic breakdown because or was it? Was there already by 1947 many Jews living in those areas that were I guess brown or whatever that color is? I can't tell. They were already there, and that's why they chose, because it's obviously a very odd shaped dynamic for both. And then, of course, there's no contiguous area for the Arabs. So I'm just wondering how they even formed that in the first place.
Well, in fact, you're right to ask the question because the Arab population felt that, but that's a proposal, by the way. It has never been set as the solution. It was a proposal. I don't know exactly. I mean, there were probably interests from the Israeli population, and the Israeli population. Oh, sorry, the Israeli population was very active. I mean, had already some lobbies in the West, and that's probably the reason why this partition was designed, and it was really unfair in some, and it was even so unfair because the Jewish population, in fact, was only 32% of the population at that time, and the Arabs had 68. So two-thirds Arabs and one-third Jews. And that's also the reason why, although the resolution provided for having those referendum, that the Jews never wanted to have this referendum, because if you see the population, in fact, you would say that any referendum would certainly be
Yeah.
in favor of the Arabs. So, and that's the reason why from November 1947 up to May 1948, when the Israeli declared independence, you had in fact a struggle. The Jewish militias took the territory by force. And that's the reason why, as they declared independence, the Arab states said, no, 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 that's not possible, because this is not what the resolution asked for. They had no referendum at all. Nobody was consulted. And in fact, the whole Israeli territory was taken by force, period. And that was not in the spirit and not in the letter of the UN resolution. So the UN resolution has never been implemented. Not a single word of this resolution has been implemented.
Okay, so now I want to ask a question. I want to ask you a question about one of the more popular things that are discussed, certainly among the Palestinian people, is the Nakba, and I wonder if you can explain how that fits in to all the stuff you just showed on that map. How does that fit into what happened, I guess, after 1948?
Well, in fact, all the people who used to live in this brown area, in fact, had to leave. And you even had, in some areas, and in fact, more than this territory, because even on the 14th May 1948, as independence was declared by Israel, they had taken more territory than just the brown territory that you have on the map. As a result, in fact, most of the Palestinians had to leave, and they regrouped in areas such as Gaza today, for instance, because Gaza is made up by refugees from the Nakba. I'm sorry, in 1948. So they had to go. Some remained on the spot, and some adjusted, and probably they accepted this situation. Others had to flee, and that's the whole Nakba result of this non-respect of the international UN resolution.
And I wonder if I could ask Colonel, in the interest of time here, because I don't want to get too bogged down in the minutia here, but at what point did the Gaza Strip get literally cordoned off so that it's fenced in, and why did that not happen in the West Bank?
Well, I will come later on that. The problem of the West Bank is that it's a complicated topic, because, in fact, the West Bank was part of Jordan, on Transjordan, so to say, or no, Jordan. And in fact, the problem is that Jordan tried to protect and to keep, in the 1948 war, Jordan tried to keep that territory for themselves. And the Gaza Strip, in fact, had been more or less agreed upon by the Israeli to push the refugees into. So it was already a refugee camp, if you want, already in 1948 at this stage. And later, Egypt, it was an Egyptian territory, by the way. So Egypt tolerated that, and you had more or less the same situation as the Israeli wants to do now by pushing people out of Rafah. Exactly the same situation. And that's what you had in 1948. So the Israeli were literally pushed into that. Other refugees were pushed out of the Palestine territory. You had these refugees in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, in Egypt, and that prompted the creation of the UNRWA, the UN Agency for the Refugees. That was UNHCR didn't exist at that point, and the UNRWA, which was in the middle of a controversy a few months ago.
Yeah, right.
The UNRWA was specifically created for the Israelis, for the Palestinian refugees, in fact, because there was no international institution to help these refugees. And that's exactly the situation that we had in 1948. But interestingly, it's interesting to see that, as you see, the resolution from the 29th of November, but one day before, the CIA wrote a report for President Truman, a national intelligence estimate, and it's advised President Truman not to accept this partition plan. And it explained Why? And this is a very interesting document, by the way, because it showed that the analysts of the CIA at that time were brilliant, literally. I just read it for the people who cannot read. In the long run, no Zionist in Palestine will be satisfied with the territorial arrangement of the partition settlement. Even the more conservative Zionists will hope to obtain the whole of the Negev, Western Galilee, the city of Jerusalem, and eventually all of Palestine. The extremists demand not only all Palestine, but Transjordan as well. They will probably undertake aggressive action to achieve these ends. In the chaos which will follow the implementation of the partition, atrocities will undoubtedly be committed by Arab fanatics. Such action will be given wide publicity and will even be exaggerated by the Jewish propaganda. The Arabs will be accused of aggression, whatever the actual circumstances may be. It's
Holy crap.
interesting because
Oh,
you,
man.
yeah, it's interesting because you could almost take every word of that paragraph for today, to describe today's situation. So you see that even the CIA was not so keen to have this partition plan because it was it was doomed to fail to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, it was
And
failure was baked in for very for all the reasons I just mentioned there. Do you know did your history uncover why the president of the United States decided to ignore that advice and did in fact recognize Israel's independence?
well, there are different uh, um, assessment on that because of course the role of the Jewish lobby was apparently quite significant in the US at the time, and also in UK, and UK was the mandatory power in Palestine. So probably that comes from there. But there was also an important aspect that we shouldn't forget is that we were just out of the Second World War,
Yeah.
and nothing to we don't want to go deeper into that because it's self-explanatory and obvious that the atrocities that were committed against the Jews during World War II were instrumental to make people understand that they needed their own territory. The problem was not so much to give them a territory, the problem was how this territory should be, in fact, divided and provided to the
Right.
Jews. And this is interesting because the Arabs at that time had in mind to have a Palestine state that would integrate both populations. So it was not designed to be a fully Arab Palestine. They accepted to have a Jewish community and Jewish communities within this territory. The problem is that the Jews wanted their own territory. And that makes the big difference. That's the reason why CIA noticed that. And we will come back on this issue of the Zionists and the border issue because it affects the situation still today. It is important to understand that the borders of Israel, in fact, have never been really solved since 1948. And we have to remember that the power or the individuals that sponsored the territory, or let's say sponsored the independence of Israel, came out of a terrorist movement. I mean, it was considered as terrorist by the British, which was the Irgun. So it was a clandestine army. Now, look at the map which is on this insignia, and you see that this map is not very similar to the state of Israel. It goes a little bit beyond that. And in fact, it takes the whole of Transjordan. And this has become a standing issue with the Israeli leadership. They never wanted to define the borders, and we'll come into detail into that because they contemplate the idea of having this the other part of Palestine, because what you see here outlined in white is in fact the mandatory Palestine that were under the British. The problem is that in the early 20s, the British gave this eastern part of Palestine, they gave it to the Jordanian, or to the Jordanian monarchy, because they were expelled from Saudi Arabia and they wanted to solve this issue. And for that reason, in fact, what was left for the Israeli, or the future Israeli, and the Palestinian was just the eastern part, the western part of the mandatory Palestine. And if we go today, well, today we have this border. We'll come to this border, because the border we have here is in fact an accepted border. Israel, since 1948, never defined its borders. And the idea was that they still contemplate the idea of having the Eretz Israel, which is the big Israel, which for most observers today is what is outlined in white here, which is the current state of Israel plus the Palestinian occupied territories and the Golan. That's what most, let's say, observers today want. But there is still this idea of having the although the territory that extends to Jordan, and you have even extreme ultra Orthodox Jews who have
Yeah.
in mind to have this Eretz Israel extending to Iraq and to Turkey and to Egypt. Basically, it's the places where the Jews historically in the Bible, in fact, this is the
Yeah, that's during
Bible.
the Solomon time right there, right?
Say again?
That's during the Solomon reign. What's in the sea, right?
Yes. So this is the whole problem of this. The Israelis still have this in mind, and therefore they never defined their borders. And what we had, so that was the territory that was proposed for partition in 1948. But after the war in 1948, you had this border. This is, I outlined it in green because it's also known internationally as the Green Line. But in fact, it has never been an official border. This is the accepted, or let's say tolerated, border of Israel today, but it has no legal basis. In fact, Israel has taken the territory, and in reality, there is absolutely no basis for the existence of Israel is legitimate because it was legitimate for the Israeli to have a territory, but this territory is not legal. And that's interesting. It's a de facto border and not a de jure border. And that's important because we have seen the various scenarios that are being contemplated by the right-wing extremists. And by the way, the Likud is derived from the Irgun, so the Likud of Benjamin Netanyahu. So he is exactly in that line. And the problem is for the Palestinians today is that they cannot recognize Israel because Israel has not defined its border. So you cannot recognize a state that has no recognized borders because then you run into the risk of recognizing a state that may claim your own territory. And that's exactly the problem we have today with the Palestinian resistance. And after the Oslo Agreement, where it was agreed upon by the two parties, the Palestinian, the Fatah of Yasser Arafat in 1999, 93, and the Israeli government, that both states would recognize each other. The Palestinians have recognized the Israeli, but the Israeli never recognized the Palestinian state. As a result, they have a kind of a blank check. And this is the problem Palestinian. And that's the reason why the Hamas, for instance, didn't accept the Oslo Agreement, because they said, well, why should we recognize Israel as long as they haven't defined any territory? And
So it's
that's
ironic
the
that you have both Netanyahu and some of the Palestinians saying we don't recognize Oslo, especially after October 7th. I know that Netanyahu many times said, "Yeah, Oslo is destroyed. We'll never go back to it," etc. Uh, Colonel, in the interest of time, I want to because I don't want to get away from
Yep.
the time we have here, especially to talk about where things go next. You mentioned just before we came on air that a lot of the things that happened in uh, on October 7th actually were started to really reach a boiling point before that. And I remember even during the summer paying attention to that before all this happened, that there was huge protests. There was, I think, somewhere around 200 Palestinians that were killed by Israeli either settlers or the security forces. Lots of anger that was boiling up. And so what actually happened on October 7th couldn't have been a surprise to too many people. But I wonder if you can kind of start from there about what you saw during the summer that caused you to even start writing this book, and then what happened actually to October 7th.
Well, in fact, you had a conjunction of events that happened since the late 2022 and in 2023. First of all, you had ongoing negotiations for the release of prisoner. The Israeli have about 5,000 Palestinian prisoners, among which you have about 1,000, more than 1,000, about 1,300 that haven't have been in prison without any charge. And there were discussions in the late 2022 to have through Qatar to have the release to negotiate the release of those prisoners. And in the late 2022, the Israeli government decided to stop this negotiation. And that was one of the first elements. Another
Mm.
element that came also at the same time, and in fact happened all during the whole 2023, is the problem of the Haram al Sharif. Haram al Sharif, or the Temple Mount, is the place where you have the Mosque of Al Aqsa. Now, what we have to understand is that there is a project, an ultra Orthodox project that has been started a few years ago that aims at building the third temple of Solomon. And the construction of this temple requires the destruction of the Al Aqsa Mosque. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque is on the Temple Mount, which official name is Haram al-Sharif, because it's a Arabic place according to UNESCO. So it's not just my decision; it's the UN decision. And this mosque, this place, the Haram al-Sharif, is the third holy place of Islam. And that means that destroying this mosque would be a catastrophe for the whole Islam. And you had many riots on the Temple Mount in the during 2023 between ultra Orthodox and Palestinians in order to solve or trying to find a solution to this problem. And that's the reason, by the way, why this operation is called Operation Flood of Al Aqsa. Al-Aqsa is the name of the mosque on the Temple Mount, and that's the reason for it. So the problem is has not been mentioned in our media, but it should not be underestimated, because that's probably the reason why Saudi Arabia today has problem joining this so-called Abraham agreement and all that with Israel, because of that precise point. Then you had another problem, and we will discuss that when we talk about the organization of Hamas, that you have in the Gaza Strip. You have Hamas rules the place, and it has not just a military force there. It has also a complete administration with welfare services and social services, provide school and all that. So it's like a state. And these all the people, these the civil servants, if you want, of the on the Gaza Strip, were paid by the Qatar. And for some reason, and to be frank with you, I have no idea why this was stopped, but the Qatar stopped to pay the wages of those civil servants, and that created a lot of troubles.
I'm
And
sorry, when was that?
already
When did they stop paying them?
that was in July. That was in May, July last year. And
Ah,
then at that point, you had the Israeli army, the Israeli military intelligence, who said that this starts to be the boiling point, and we from that point we may have a big problem. And in fact, this the problem was anticipated by the Israeli intelligence, because they noticed that there was a conjunction of issues that were coming all at the same time. And in addition to that, what you had in the West Bank was the extension of the settlements. And the new government, or the government of Netanyahu, which is right wing, as you know, is in fact has declared that the settlements in the West Bank are declared as national value. As a result, there is no way they will back down or go back. This will continue, and in fact, it has continued, and it had led to several clashes between Palestinians and the Israeli forces. And for that reason, by the way, on the 7th of October, you had forces that were basically dedicated to the monitoring and the surveillance of the Gaza Strip, who had been sent to the West Bank because of the rising tension on the area. And that's why, in fact, that's probably the reason why the Hamas decided to attack on the 7th of October, because they were probably less military presence. I don't know if it was a
so I'm
coincidence or
curious if the Israeli, whether it was the Shin Bet or Mossad or just whatever, any other kind of military folks, if they recognized in the summer that things were reaching to a boiling point, especially after Qatar stopped the payments, and that caused a lot of internal strife, how could they have been so shocked on October 7th?
Well, that's a good question. The problem is that probably they felt that the situation in the West Bank was probably more dangerous than the one in the Gaza Strip. And
Wow,
in fact, you have
interesting.
to realize that in the West Bank, uh, the settlers and the Israeli forces are in touch, in contact with the Palestinians. While on the Gaza Strip, you have this fence and you had kind of a buffer zone, if you want. So
Yeah.
probably that's the reason why they considered that the situation in the West Bank was probably more dangerous, and for that reason they had to deploy more troops there. In addition to that, the West Bank is a huge area, while the Gaza Strip is a rather small areas, which is probably easier to control. So that's probably the situation that led to the 7th of October. Now, an important thing is that we have also to remember that the Palestinian resistance is fully legitimate, and I think it's important because people tend to forget that. And that's the General Assembly Resolution 45-1130 that reaffirms the legitimacy of the resistance in Israel, in Palestine, and they are even allowed to use all available means, including armed struggle. So the Palestinian resistance is in fact totally legitimate, based on the international law, and that's for the reason we have this defined before, or viewed before, uh, that the whole occupation of Israel, first of all, but also of the so-called occupied territories. I mean, the territories that have been occupied after June 1968, 67. All these territories are illegally occupied by Israel, and for that reason, the Palestinian resistance is fully legitimate. And this is important because we come then into the creation of the Hamas. And I wanted to explain that because everybody sees the Hamas as a terrorist movement, which undoubtedly the Hamas used to be a terrorist movement, and it was created in 1987, and its covenant on the 1988, that is the piece of paper you have in front of you, in fact was extremely harsh against Israel and even asked for the destruction of Israel and all that. And in fact, when we mention the Hamas in the media today, we still refer to that document. But that's a lie, because in reality, in since the Hamas took or was elected, in fact, in 2006 in the Gaza Strip, they started to take seriously the political dimension of the movement, and they adopted another charter. Um, which has been published in 2017, which is totally different from the previous one. It doesn't ask for the destruction of Israel anymore. It still asks for a one country solution, but it's absolutely not against the Jews, and it is explicitly not against the Jews. So when you have in the media that the Hamas want to destroy all the Jews and all that, is totally wrong. It's explicitly not so in the document. And in fact, there is also no indication that the Hamas has another policy than the one which is described in this document, by the way.
Yeah,
So
let me ask you something, Colonel, because I know that. Well, first of all, I wanted to ask you a little clarification on something you just said a second ago about you said the Hamas used to be a terrorist organization, implying that they were not. Now, I'm guessing that you mean like earlier in their formation, then for a period of time they weren't, and obviously they started to be on October 7th. But I remember distinctly, and I wonder if you can discuss the disparity between the document and what was said. And I can't remember if it was Sinwar or one of the other leaders shortly after October 7th was point blank asked in one of, I think it was Al Jazeera, they said, do you still advocate for the destruction of Israel? And he said, absolutely. They have no place. We still want them destroyed. And I don't know if that was because of what happened on with what the Israelis had done when they went in and started attacking in the Gaza Strip, or if he was referring back to the original document. I wonder if you can talk about some of that disparity.
Well, in fact, we have to be very prudent here. When I say that Hamas used to be terrorist, it used to be terrorist because it used to do terrorist attacks, so bombings and things like that, which are basically terroristic
And that's in the
in
1980s, I
essence.
guess you're talking about.
Yes, exactly. The late 80s
Okay.
up to the early 2000s, I would say. So this is absolutely clear. The thing is that they changed their policy because they realized, as did Yasser Arafat, by the way, in the 70s, that using terroristic approach was not the best solution in to have international support, especially because after the 9/11 in the US, you had, in fact, the struggle against Islamists started to be everywhere in the whole world. And even the Israeli government at that point said, okay, so the US have Al Qaeda, we also have our Al Qaeda, this is the Hamas and all that. And as a result, the Hamas tried to distance itself from the Al Qaeda. And in reality, the Hamas is a purely Palestinian resistance movement. It has never waged any attack outside of the, let's say, the territory of Palestine, if you want. And it has never attacked any other power outside Israel. And this is the reason why the Hamas slightly changed its policy to have a more, let's say, politically correct position. It's still a resistance movement. It's still fighting against an occupation power, which is Israel, basically, and so they feel at war against Israel. So we have to understand that, because it's exactly the same thing as the U.S. was in Iraq, or the Afghan the NATO and others were in Afghanistan. They feel at war against them, and that's exactly what the Palestinian feel. So therefore, we have to be very careful about what they say. Yes, of course, so when you're against an enemy, you want to destroy your enemy. That's normal, but doesn't mean basically that's what you it's not your policy. It's something you may be pushed to or towards,
So
but it
do
doesn't.
you hold that? Did October 7th change that? Because obviously, when they went in there into Israel and killed, especially the civilians, if they had just gone after military targets, it might be somewhat of a different conversation, perhaps. But because they killed so many civilians, doesn't that almost by definition make them a terrorist organization again?
Well, again, this is the problem here, and that's why I don't like to use this word terrorist, because it's so politically loaded. Remember that only the Western countries consider the Hamas as terrorist. The rest of the world doesn't. It's an important point, by the way. If I'm not wrong, the UN never declared the Hamas as terrorist organization, for instance. So this is, and by the way, this is the same thing as the Taliban in Afghanistan. They were not declared as terrorists by even by the US, in fact, because they wanted to keep away to the Taliban
Yeah.
in Pakistan were considered as terrorists, but not the Taliban in Afghanistan. So we have to be very careful with the use of these words. And in addition to that, to answer your question, we will talk about what happened on the 7th of October. But I think personally that before we make a judgment on the 7th of October, we need first to have an assessment, or let's say a probe by the international community, an independent, objective, and impartial probe into what happened on the 7th of October, because you will see that the things are not as clear as you may think. The reality of what happened. We see those guys fighting. We see them firing their arms. We see them, but beyond that, that doesn't explain the whole aspect of what happened on that very day. But I will come on this later, if you don't mind. But I just wanted to say that the Hamas, in my view, we should be careful by using the word terrorist, because by qualifying them as terrorists, we exclude every possibility to negotiate. And even the British. I used to be trained in British intelligence in the 80s, and that was during the war in Northern Ireland, and even the British, in fact, at one point they had to negotiate with the terrorists. So we need to be very careful by using these words and saying, well, we don't talk to terrorists. This
Right.
is
So, and that actually is the case right now, because you have, at least at the government level in the United States, but absolutely authoritatively in Israel, they have, and you see it's actually a stated objective of
yeah, I know.
Netanyahu, the complete and utter eradication of Hamas. So the question is going to be, even if Netanyahu succeeds, and by whatever means that he comes up with in his mind, that they destroy Hamas. I don't know how you physically do that, but then at some point, some entity still has to exist with which you negotiate or govern, even in the Gaza Strip. And I think that's one of the bigger issues coming
Well,
out of this.
we will talk about this later, because as we see, we always talk about the Hamas, but in reality, what happened on the 7th of October is the product of several movements, and not just the Hamas. The Hamas being the most important, but it's also something that was waged, and still, by the way, what happens on the ground right now is not just the Hamas fighting Israeli forces. You have several other movements, and we'll go into this later. So. And we can go into probably into the structure of the Hamas if you want. I will go back to these to the what happened on the 7th of October. I wanted to go on on the fundamentals before. And
Yeah, if we
if
could, I don't want to run out of time. We're coming up on the hour, so I want to make sure we don't miss what actually happened on October 7th. So if you could maybe catch that part.
So I let the movie finish, and we can go into the structure, and then that's the structure of the Hamas, and that's important. I don't want to go into every detail of that, but the important thing here is to understand that there is a military wing and a civilian wing. And the military wing is, in essence, well, you have a security service here, and you have the Izzedin al-Qassam brigades or Katayeb, which is basically the essence of the military force. All that is about between 30 to 40,000 individuals here. And the civilian part, that's the part that in fact manages the Gaza Strip, and does provide social services, relief for instance, hospitals and things like this. This part here, and that's the part that was not paid by Qatar during the summer last year, is about 50,000 individuals. The civilian part is bigger than the military part. The other aspect that we have to understand is when you had in late January last year, or February last year, when the Israeli claimed that the UN agency in charge of the refugees in the Gaza Strip was in fact working with the terrorist organization. In fact, they were talking about the civilian part of the uh, that's the civilian part of the Hamas. The problem is that the Israeli government takes the whole organization as terrorists. They don't make the distinction between the military part and the civilian part. And for that reason, in fact, this is just a political trick, if you want. But let me go further into the military organization. And when we talk about, sorry. When we talk about the military organization, as I said, what happened on the 7th of October is not just the Hamas that worked. In fact, it's an organization that is called the Joint Operation Room, which is this organization here that is in fact a coalition of all these movements that are in the Gaza Strip. You have, of course, you have the Hamas, but you also have the Islamic Jihad, and you have other than the FPLP, and even the Fatah, or some elements of the Fatah, and so on. So you have about 12 different militias that are at work together and made this 14th, this 7th of October attack. Now, probably before we have the consequence, it's interesting to see how this attack unfolded. And we can go here. I have a small video it's a propaganda movie from the Hamas, and it shows how this attack unfolded. So it explains that the first step of this attack was in fact to attack all the observation posts that were along the fence of the Gaza Strip, and all the intelligence and the sensors were destroyed with drones dropping bombs on them, and that they did that at the simultaneously. Then you had these rocket launches that were designed to provide cover for the paragliders that made the attack, the ones you have here on the screen. These paragliders were in fact, it's exactly like a military operation. You start this artillery fire to provide cover for people who go deep into the enemy, to open kind of a bridgehead, if you want. And you had these guys here, and you had at the same time, you had the first element of the land operation there. Now, how this land operation happened, they obviously forced their way through the fence. Here they have the explosive frames that could make a cut into the fence, and allowed so guys with bike and very mobile units to go through and to attack the to go deep into the territory of Israel. You see over there that the tower is has been disabled. You see the dome is just destroyed. So that's how the whole thing started. Now, if we go on the map, we can see that the idea of the Hamas was in fact to take prisoners in order to force the Israeli to force them back to the negotiation to the release of the prisoners. I told you that in end of 2022, the Israeli broke the negotiations, and the idea of the Hamas was to take prisoners, to resume, to force Israel to resume the discussions. And basically, they attacked about 25 military objects along this area, which is called the Gaza envelope, which is the area that is designed to create a kind of a buffer zone between the Gaza Strip and the territory of Israel. This is under the responsibility of the so-called Gaza Division. The headquarters of this division is in the base of the military base of Reim here. And this is important because in Reim, you had at the same time, that's where you had the music festival that was uh, uh, just on the fence, almost, or the fence of the military base. Then you had other targets, namely Urim, which was attacked by a small commando. Urim is the intelligence coordination center that coordinates all intelligence activities in the Gaza Strip. And from that place, you have, for instance, the unit 8200, which is a signals intelligence unit, which is based here and monitors all the communication in the Gaza Strip. You had the Eretz. This is a strategic crossing point here, and the naval base, or yes, it was a naval base of Zikim, which was attacked by like the I would say the seals of the Hamas, and they fight there almost 1 week actually. So that's the maximal line of advance of the Palestinians there, and that's what happened. Now, what happened in this place, especially in the Reim area? This was in fact described by two journalists of the magazine Idiot Achonot. They made a detailed account of what happened in these on that day, and they explained that what happened on that day is in fact much more controversial as we may think, because in fact what they say is that the Israeli command and control was totally taken by surprise. Why that? Because the Palestinians managed to disrupt the whole intelligence uh, uh, capabilities of the Israelis. We have seen that they destroyed all the observation posts in the along the fence, if you want, and they also managed to disrupt all the communication. As a result, the Gaza division, which is in charge of monitoring the whole Gaza Strip and the basically the Gaza envelope around the Gaza Strip, they were totally blind, and they were not able to identify what was going on. They knew that it was an attack. They knew that the Palestinians had forced their way into the fence, but they didn't know how many people. They didn't know what was attacked. They didn't know the magnitude of the attack, and therefore they had a completely the Israeli command came into panic. The
So
command
let me ask you
post.
this question at this point. So it sounds like your assessment is that the initial intent was to hit military targets and to get civilian hostages for the purpose of negotiating going back here. But what happened and broke down when obviously a number of people from the strip that escaped actually went after civilian people and just started killing large numbers of them? What broke down at that point?
Well, then we'll come into that. We'll come into that. But before, I just want to say something. The problem is that the Palestinians, their aim was to catch military prisoners to exchange, because for them, according to them, the military personnel has more value than the civilians to make some kind of discussions with the Israeli leadership. So that was the idea. Now, what happened is the music festival was not supposed to be there. In fact, the festival was supposed to end on the Friday night, the Friday before, and it was extended because it was successful, and the organizers asked authorization to extend this festival to Saturday morning, and that was granted. By the way, this is still a discussion, because during the night before the attack, the Israeli intelligence noted unusual activities in the Gaza Strip, and you had an emergency meeting at that was midnight before the attack with the military of the Gaza division, in order to identify what can we expect. And they raised the emergency level, but they didn't extend the extension of this emergency level to the problem of the music festival. They didn't expect something in that of that magnitude, and that's the reason why, in fact, they didn't take action. And the day after, as the Palestinian attacked, they were surprised to find the civilians. And in fact, we have even witnesses saying that the Palestinians were asking their way to the to the young guys who were in the festival. They were asking their way to the military base, because, as I told you, the festival was just beneath
Yeah,
the military
yeah,
base.
yeah.
And so this was another aspect, is that, as I told you before, because the Israeli command had to take some soldiers from the Gaza area to the West Bank. In fact, the problem is that the Palestinians didn't find the military they were looking for, and in fact, they entered even some kibbutz area, and they asked the civilians to call the security forces, and they started to wait for the security forces with the civilians in order to take prisoner from the security forces. And that's interesting, because that was reported by Israeli journalists. So, and that tends to confirm that the Palestinians didn't want, or didn't came to take civilians, and probably because they were forced to go back to the Gaza Strip, and they hadn't found enough prisoners, if you want. They took civilians instead, but
Yeah,
that was
and
probably not.
Colonel, I want to show just real quick, just to kind of underscore the emotions of that day. Here is the description of one of those people, civilians, who was taken. Gary, roll that tape.
איך אני מגנה פה על הבנות שלי? אנחנו עושים את לא יודעת, 2.5 קילומטר האלה. ואני לא מרימה את הראש. אז אנחנו מגיעים לאיזושהי נקודה, אז אני עוד פעם מתרוממת. ובא מישהו וחוטף לי את הילדה מהידיים, את אמא. פשוט לוקח לי, אני במצב שבו היא הייתה עליי, הוא בא ולוקח לי, מושך לי את הילדה מהידיים. ובשלב הזה פתחתי את הפה, בשלב הזה ניסיתי לצעוק, בנתי, בנתי, בנתי. זה לא עזר. לקח לי את הילדה, כיוון אליי רובה, סימן לי לשבת. ואין לי מה לעשות. כי אם אני מתה פה, אז גם הבת שלי נשארת לבד, או מתה אחריי. אני לא יכולתי לשמור על הילדה. אני לא יכולתי לשמור על הילדה. על ילדה בת 3 ו3 חודשים.
So, Colonel, what do you say to some of the reports that came out probably within a month or so of October 7th that says that whatever intent the Hamas military wing may have had, apparently once those, I think it was like 30 breaches or 20, whatever the number was, that many of just regular Palestinian men took advantage of the opportunity and that literally went on a killing rampage. How do you see that part happening of the civilians?
No, I mean, I haven't seen any evidence of that, but that probably happened. That's probably happened, but I haven't seen any evidence of that. And in fact, what we have seen, and if we look at what we have seen, because what happened after the initial attack, and as the Israeli command could not figure out what was going on the area, they sent combat Apache helicopters, basically. And these guys, they saw a confusion on the ground, and they asked the command what to do. And since nobody knew what was going on, in fact, they gave the green light to open fire. And these guys started to open fire on almost anything. And that comes from the Israeli forces footage, and you see that you had a lot of people that are obviously not Hamas people, and these guys were all shot by helicopters. Like this car, I mean, this is the footage just before it was exploded, but you see that this car had nothing to do with the kind of pickup trucks that used to be used by the Hamas. So basically, you had a total panic on the ground. I also have this testimony from this young tank commander who was sent in the kibbutz Be'eri. She's commander of a Merkava tank. I mean, basically, you had a squad of a platoon of a Merkava tank who was sent over there, and she was said, and as she says here on the Israeli TV, said she asked if there were people on the building she was supposed to shoot at, and she asked, are there civilians there? And people said, well, we don't care, just shoot. And that's exactly what happened, in fact, and that's the reason why most probably the Hamas did some war crimes during that day. That's most probably true, but probably not to the extent that we are seeing in the media. And the problem here is not to say that they are good guys or bad guys. It's not the problem. The problem is that then the crimes or the alleged crimes of the 7th of October were then used to justify the bombing of the Gaza Strip. And that's the issue, because we took advantage, or we tried to justify a crime with another one. And the magnitude of the first crime has not been demonstrated in any way. And that's, in fact, there are many people, and including those two journalists of Idiot Achonot and several other journalists and there are more and more testimonies and emerging in the Israeli press, suggesting that there were probably some wrongdoing from the Hamas, but not in the dimension we have seen, or that are alleged to the for that day. So we have to be very, very careful here, especially when we try to use a narrative to justify another crime. And
Well, it does,
it's
Colonel, and that kind of brings us really up back to where we are today, because all the things that happened on October 7th were, if you say 1,200 Israelis were killed, both military and civilian, and it really doesn't matter by whom they were killed or what the message, because any kind of conflict gets messy then. But none of them should have happened. But then in lieu of that, or in result of that, 33,000 people in Palestine have been killed, and most of their ability to sustain life in the city has been wiped out. But now then, here's where we are right now. And this is where I want to get your comment now. Based on all of that stuff, all the history that led up to it, what started October 7th and where the people are now, what do you think is going to happen here? Because right now, as we speak, there is apparently an operation that Netanyahu claimed that there's a date to start in Rafah. And at least up to this point, there's no plan to get those people out of there. So if they go in and attack, there's going to be another huge spike in civilian casualties. And here's what Netanyahu said. No, I'm sorry. First of all, this is what the President Biden said on the 10th. So yesterday, in relationship, and this is why this ties in so strong into this, after Israel attacked or assassinated an Iranian general in the consulate building in Syria and destroyed that building, and as the world waits on what happens right now, Biden is basically saying no matter what Iran does, Israel has basically a free check to do whatever they want. Here's what he said.
We also want to address the Iranian threat to launch they're threatening to launch a significant attack on Israel. As I told Prime Minister Netanyahu, our commitment to Israel's security against these threats from Iran and its proxies is ironclad. Let me say it again, ironclad. We're going to do all we can to protect Israel's security.
And here's in response, actually the day before, I believe it does, or no, this was today. Here's Netanyahu's response.
אמרתי שאנחנו בימים מאתגרים. אנחנו בעיצומה של המלחמה בעזה שנמשכת במלוא עוזה. במקביל אנחנו ממשיכים במאמצים שלא נפסקים כדי להחזיר את חטופינו. אבל אנחנו נערכים גם לתרחישים של אתגרים מזירות אחרות. ואנחנו קבענו עיקרון פשוט. מי שפוגע בנו, אנחנו פוגעים בו. אנחנו נערכים לענות על הצרכים הביטחוניים של מדינת ישראל, גם בהגנה וגם בהתקפה.
Really telling there, I think at the end, that he specified an offensive, which primarily would mean potentially and or Hezbollah in the north in Lebanon or against Iran. So how do you see this stuff playing out right now, given all the foregoing?
Well, in fact, the problem of Israel is that since the early 50s, in fact, and that happened regularly since then, the Israeli tried to drag the US into the area. And there's a famous Lavon affair in Egypt in the 50s. Then you had also, by the way, you may remember the bombing of the US Marines in Beirut in October 1989, that the Israeli had foreknowledge of, but they didn't warn the Americans, because they expected that the Americans would then enter the region and fight in fact fight the militias in Lebanon. So this was reported by an Israeli former Mossad agent, Viktor Ostrovsky, and he has wrote a book about this area. So this has been a constant effort of the Israeli. The problem is that Israel has always considered that its security would be better if its neighbors are at fight between each other. And so that's why Israel has always tried to, in fact, it's a strategic idea of the chaos, using the chaos to preserve itself to some extent. So the people will spend their time fighting each other instead of being attack itself. And this is a little bit the strategy of the Israeli. The problem is that today you have a very strong Hezbollah. Hezbollah has probably the strongest army in the Near East right now, and it's not an offensive army. It's an army which is not designed for offensive war, but for the defensive one. But it's a very strong, and it has in the last months, Hezbollah has attacked significant Israeli installation in the, I mean, intelligence structures in the Golan area and all that. And Israel, in fact, is sitting between two chairs because it cannot really react without going into full war with Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is very strong. So you can see what happens with the Hamas. Hamas has not a very strong army, but within the Gaza Strip right now, in fact, Israeli didn't have any part of the Gaza Strip under control or the full control. The Hamas and its allies are in fact fully in control of the Gaza Strip. You have some Israeli troops there, but they are permanently harassed by this. It's a guerrilla activity, by the way. So if the Israeli would like to do the same in South Lebanon, they would suffer probably even more casualties, and that's for
Yeah.
the reason why, in fact, Israel is really sitting between two chairs, whether it should react or not. And that's the reason why it would like to have the US there, because it sees
Right.
that now it cannot manage, because in fact right now Israel is fighting on three fronts, basically. I mean, military front. You have Gaza, definitely. You have the West Bank, and the tension in the West Bank has increased. I mean, it increased regularly since last October, and there are some indications that it may erupt in something more violent now. And of course, the northern front with the Hezbollah. I have to also to underline that along the border with South Lebanon, the Israeli have evacuated all the civilians. So there are something like 100,000, 150,000 civilians who have been evacuated from the northern border because the tension is so high. So Israel is a little bit at the limit of its capacities here. And that's the reason why it would be interesting for them to have a foreign presence and the US. The problem is that right now the US is, you know better than me, that the US is now into a presidential election year, and with the problem in Ukraine and no solution in sight in Ukraine, there is not much appetite to go physically in the Middle East.
Yeah,
In
I
addition
think that
to
the Biden administration wants to thread the needle of sounding, pro-Israel, and we got your back to keep a lot of their voters happy, but not so far that they actually have to
Exactly.
act on it. Because
Exactly.
starting a war in a presidential election is it's a bad juju. It's not gonna help him out here. Colonel, I
Absolutely.
wonder if in the last few minutes that we have, I wonder if you could talk about what you think Iran may do, because we were talking before we went on the air that you have a different view than a lot of people, that that you don't think Iran is going to do some big splashy thing, which I think many in Israel are hoping for, because that will justify doing something on the aftermath. But what do you expect out of the Iranians?
No, I think, well, the Iranians have been very clear so far. They will not respond directly to the Israelis. I mean, with direct involvement, like shooting missiles or having some air attack or something like that. No, they probably use their proxies. Maybe they will provide more weapons to the Hezbollah, or they may use it, also provide more weapons to the Iraqi militias that are pro-Iranians, and you have several militias. In fact, our media didn't mention that, but in reality, in the last couple of months, you had Iraqi, I mean, pro-Iranian militias in Iraq who have shot missiles towards Haifa, for instance. They have damaged seriously the oil reserves of Israel in the area of the port of Haifa. And they sent several cruise missiles even towards Israel. That's about 500 kilometers from Iraq. So it shows that these militias have some capabilities and capacities in order to create some problems to the Israelis. And that's probably what the Iranians will do. They will not go directly, because there are so many people, even in the US, by the way, who are so impatient to have an opportunity to strike within
Indeed,
Iraq
there are. We've shown some on this
in
channel.
itself. Exactly. So I think the Iranians are very aware of that, and they will not go directly with that. But they may provide a few additional weapons and creates probably some incentives for
And
those
last question:
militias.
Do you think there's any chance that Iran may say, you know what, we just have to have a nuclear weapons program. We're going to push over that final edge and actually have a weapons program? Would they risk that?
No, I don't think so. The Iranians, they had the idea of having a nuclear weapon project, and they started in the short after the U.S. Invaded Iraq in 2003. They shortly contemplated the idea of having a nuclear program, and then they studied the feasibility. And apparently, they noted that it would create more problems than solutions, and they abandoned the idea. And since then, the Israeli claim that the Iranian have a nuclear weapons project, but in fact, even the UN agency that monitors the nuclear atomic agency, I don't know the acronym in English, but they have never found any proof and evidence that the Iranians had a nuclear weapons program. They have capabilities to enrich uranium. They have the ability, and probably they could enrich uranium to the weaponization level. So that's definitely true. But there is apparently no willingness to do so. And in fact, why should they do this so? They have enough capabilities to act with other proxies and people on the ground that may, in fact, support Iran in such a situation. So I think I don't see that personally. And we have also to say that the Iran has extended its cooperation with Russia, with China, and both countries are probably not so keen supporting the idea of having a nuclear Iran.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, listen, Colonel, we are so grateful for your insights today, and this great. I know we could have gone another 2 or 3 hours and still not hit it all. But we're grateful for your time and deepening our understanding on this very complicated issue. And we are definitely going to keep watching what happens in the coming even hours, possibly. And definitely as the weeks pass by and more things keep happening here, we'll keep touching you for your expertise and explanations.
Thank you. Thank you for having me in your show. Thank you very much.
Always our pleasure. And thank you for joining us today. We're always grateful for you folks who come out here and watch us every day. Don't forget, we have a great show for you this afternoon with John Mearsheimer. He's going to be talking about a claim by Vladimir Zelensky that he's going to have a new counteroffensive. Not sure what that's all about, but we'll be checking that out. And then you will not want to miss John Mearsheimer today. So join us at that point. Be sure to like and subscribe and share this with your friends, because remember, we're all in this together, and we remain, along with you, unintimidated and uncompromised. We'll see you this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.